Hi, everyone. It's Naomi Wolf here in Corvallis, Oregon with Daily Cloud. I'm broadcasting from the beautiful Pacific Northwest, and you can see how different the background is here from my usual New York apartment. So today, in spite of the beauty of the setting, I'm going to be talking about something very serious. Those of us who follow the news know that there has been detention of families that were separated by ICE, and more recently, after challenges, the ruling has been established that the families need to not be separated. But Marjorie Cohn, who is formerly with important civil rights organizations and is now an important writer on civil rights issues and very, very good at explaining them to non-lawyers, has written a really, really critical piece that we've published in Daily Cloud, explaining how ICE, increasingly a rogue state, and this is not a partisan thing I'm saying, it's just about our willingness to engage with the rule of law and to follow the rule of law internationally and to follow norms of diplomacy internationally. Our allies are seeing, that we're less and less inclined to do that. And so specifically when it comes to the detention of immigrants and families, Marjorie Cohn explains how illegal, the U.S.'s current actions are. So I'm just going to lift out the high points of Marjorie Cohn's explanation to all of us non-lawyers out there, because as you know, here at Daily Cloud, we really believe in explaining the law to everybody, that no one should be kept from knowing and understanding the laws that govern our societies, and also we empower you to change the laws. So she points out that the Trump administration separated some 2,300 migrant children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border since just May, and it's only the end of July now as I broadcast, and that the world has condemned this widely. And she points out that on June 26th, a San Francisco federal judge ordered the government to reunite the families and actually set a timetable. A federal judge said, this is not okay, this is not lawful, you need to put these families back together again. So the next day, the Department of Justice filed a notice of compliance with the court order, but said that it intended to indefinitely detain these families together. So this is something that has not been widely noticed, that yes, the Trump administration, the DOJ is reuniting these families, but then they're planning to hold them indefinitely, forever if necessary. And she points out that indefinite detention, and this was a point I made in my book, The End of America, and it's not rocket science, right? We should all know this. Indefinite detention violates international law. It also violates the United States Constitution, which calls for due process of law. So the government will not separate families, but it will detain families together during the pendency of immigration proceedings when they are apprehended at or between ports of entry, said the DOJ. So the DOJ isn't doing this in secret, and I'm going to move away a little bit to get a bit of a quieter atmosphere. The DOJ isn't doing this in secret. They're being perfectly public about their intention to hold families indefinitely. So she points out that would amount to indefinite detention, as immigration cases can last for months or even years. And she highlights a 1997 settlement called the Flores Agreement, which a lot of you have asked about, rightly, which requires that detained immigrant children be released after 20 days. And, that's a way to make sure that these kids are not held, forever, and to make sure that they are attended to in a timely way and that they're not suffering due process, from due process being kept from them. So, the Justice Department asked, when they responded to this court order, they asked if they could please pay no attention to the Flores Agreement. They basically said, please allow us to indefinitely detain migrants. And the judges are not taking this quietly. And again, this is not a partisan issue. It's about basic rights. So on July 2nd, a federal judge in Washington ordered the government to give asylum applicants a meaningful opportunity to be released. So a judge in Washington, and this is not Democrat or Republican, it's about judges saying to the executive branch, actually, no, this is not constitutional. It's not lawful. And they point out that more than 1,000 applicants have been incarcerated for months or years with no resolution of their cases. So just because someone is in detention with ICE doesn't mean that they're going to be released. It can take years. Indefinite detention violates the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, she says, and it also violates the Refugee Convention and the Convention for the Rights of the Child. So Marjorie Cohn makes the case that 3 different rules of law are violated. It's not just illegal in one jurisdiction or according to one system of law. There are 3 different kinds of law governing kids in custody, families in custody, both from the domestic to the international, and the Department of Justice's actions violate 3 of them. All right. So first, she points out it violates the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So she points out that the US has ratified, that means they are participating, we are participating in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, making its provisions part of US law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. In other words, by signing on to this, we added it to our own system of laws. And it says treaties, quote, shall be the supreme law of the land. So the UN Human Rights Committee is the expert body that monitors compliance with this covenant. And that committee has stated that detentions are arbitrary if they do not accord with due process and are manifestly disproportional, unjust, or unpredictable. So that's the UN saying this is not lawful. And we signed on to it. It's not the UN meddling in our law. This is now part of our law. And, the body that's charged with making sure that this law is complied with has said this is not okay. Keeping families locked up for months with no good reason is unjust and inappropriate. She points out it denies them due process. Moreover, the Human Rights Committee has said that even if detention is initially legal, it could become, quote, arbitrary if unduly prolonged or subject to, or not subject to periodic review. So there are many ways they point out that this is not lawful. And they also, a lot of people have asked reasonably, whatever their politics are, well, doesn't due process just apply to US citizens? And she points out that no, the covenant's provisions are not limited to citizens, but apply in cases of immigration control as well. And that parties to the covenant, and the US is a party, may refuse to comply with them only, quote, in time of public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation. So no one's arguing that families are being held forever in detention because we're in a state of public emergency. And she points out that the UN independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order wrote that neither war nor terror nor restrictive immigration policies justify indefinite detention. And those of you who've been following this, know that, back to 2008, I've been pointing out what the dangers of indefinite detention are, whether they're justified through immigration policy or whether they're justified through, the threat of terrorism, which is how all of those guys in Guantanamo, and there's still 170 of them, are, their detention, their indefinite detention is still unlawfully being justified as a function of a need because of terrorism, allegedly. The second law she points out that holding these families indefinitely violates is the Refugee Convention. She points out that the U.S. is also a party, meaning the U.S. signed the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which prohibits parties from imposing penalties on refugees for illegal entry or presence in a country. And so this law, which we signed on to, says that after initial period of detention, it allows countries to impose restrictions on refugees' movements if they are, quote, necessary for national security or in special circumstances. such as a mass arrival of immigrants, and neither of these conditions was present before Trump ordered indefinite detention of families. So that's not okay. I mean, we're violating that law in that regard, she says. And then the last thing is that it's a violation of the Convention on Rights of the Child. So there are special laws, special international laws protecting children. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child states, no child shall be deprived of his or her liberty unlawfully or arbitrarily. The arrest, detention, or imprisonment of a child shall be in conformity with the law and shall be used only as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time. So the UN has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, this is not a partisan issue. Maybe we should think about that. The U.S. has not signed on to this law, making sure that children do not get arbitrarily locked up or held forever. But a primary object of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is to protect the best interests of the child. And Ravina Shamdasari, who's a spokesperson for the UN High Commission on Human Rights, says that detention is never in the best interest of a child. It always creates a child rights violation. So in this case, she's not arguing that the U.S. has broken the law that applies to the U.S. because the U.S. didn't sign on to that convention. But I think you can judge for yourself, how the rest of the world is seeing us, because the UN and the people in charge of monitoring human rights around the world are saying detention is never in the best interest of the child. It always violates those children's rights. And this is the last thing. And it's kind of, as they say, burying the lead in journalism for me to tell you about this now at the end of this broadcast. But the Pentagon is building migrant housing on military bases. Let me say that again. The Pentagon is building migrant housing on military bases. And as it formulates plans to indefinitely detain migrant families, the Pentagon is constructing temporary housing for them. And, we know with government and the military that temporary often doesn't mean temporary, at 2 Texas military bases, Fort Bliss in El Paso and Goodfellow Air Force Base near San Angelo. A U.S. Navy internal document says the Navy is planning to build tent cities to house migrants, including 2 camps in California, slated to house up to 47,000 people each. They will be called, quote, austere tent cities. And austere means simple to impoverished. Since 1983, one of the sites, the former Concord Naval Weapons Station in California, has been undergoing, quote, cleanup of Navy contamination and is not suitable for transfer or for human occupation, according to Concord's own mayor, Eddie Bierson. So you got to process this. The Navy is planning to put 47,000 people in a military site that is contaminated, that is not fit for human habitation, And the mayor of that town, Concord, California, and Concord I'm from California, it's right in the middle of everything. It's not distant to anything. It's near major cities. It's near San Francisco. It's a huge influx of human beings, right? And the mayor of this town, who doesn't want it, says the idea that you put almost 50,000 people in a tent city facility in the middle of the Bay Area, an urban area, is absurd, he says. And California's representatives are opposed to it. California Rep. Mark DeSaulnier wrote in a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, "This does remind me of World War II and Japanese internment. We don't want to be a party to that." So let me just restate this and really call your attention to it. I am the author of The End of America, and step 10 is martial law. You've got the democratically elected representatives, mayor and California rep, arguing with the U.S. Navy, right? The U.S. military saying, do not incarcerate tens of thousands of people who are being held in violation of their rights against the law. Do not incarcerate them here. It reminds us of World War II and Japanese internment camps, which everyone now agrees was a big historical mistake, to say the least. And this is California, right, which remembers that history. I mean, I learned about the Japanese internment camps in elementary school and in high school as a shameful blot on our history. And now, with no fanfare, with no headlines, until I read Marjorie Cohn's piece, I didn't even know this was happening, and I follow this stuff carefully. 50,000 people are going to be deprived of their rights of due process and housed on a military base. And let me remind you, as a student of history, people, once you start building housing for civilians in the absence of the rule of law on a military base, it never just stops with the people that they start with. That's what history has shown us again and again and again. Once you start interning people without due process of law on a military base, it may start with immigrants, but it will move on to critics of the administration, union leaders, activists, dissidents, journalists, editors. That is what history shows us always. And the fact that this is happening, you know, really without public comment or release of public statements on any grand scale is very, very concerning. It should concern the people of California that, you know, the Navy is building a detention center, 20 minutes from San Francisco, as I recall. So in the meantime, local officials across the US are resisting Trump's inhumane policies, writes Marjorie Cohn. And again, this is not partisan. That, you know, let's say illegal, to make it not partisan. Officials in Texas near Austin, California's Sacramento County, Springfield County in Western Oregon, and Alexandria, Virginia. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that Alexandria was a site. Have canceled deals with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's ICE, to detain immigrants. So elected officials across the country, and this is where I do feel like a proud American, elected officials are saying, no, this is un-American, it's unconstitutional, it's illegal, it violates the rule of law, it's abuse of children. And she concludes this is a different body than the UN Human Rights Council, from which the United States recently withdrew. She points that out. About one of the treaties above. So the piece ends by her pointing out that these elected officials in these cities around the country, and I'm going to say them again in case one of them is near you or is your city, are saying, no, we are not complying. We don't want to do this. We don't want to take these people and detain them unlawfully. And the cities are in Texas near Austin, Sacramento County in California, Springfield County in Western Oregon, and Alexandria, Virginia, as well as Concord, California. So these are all places where these unlawful detention centers are slated to open, not just for the kids, which we know about, but for entire families who might be held without due process for months or years or indefinitely, according to what the Justice Department under this administration is now claiming. So this is Naomi Wolf. Again, the essay is by Marjorie Cohn, distinguished lawyer and human rights activist. It's published on Daily Clout, and we've created this video to share this information with you more broadly, because you deserve to know, you deserve to think about it, and you deserve to let your administration, let your president, let your Justice Department, and let your elected representatives, especially if you live in one of these areas, know whether you want tens of thousands of families held illegally, I'm trying to say this very neutrally, in your area against 3 treaties of domestic and international law, or whether you think this is not a good idea, you don't want them, and you don't think it sets a good precedent for our democracy. This is Naomi Wolf at Daily Clout, and please remember to like, share, subscribe, and become members of Daily Clout, because that supports independent reporting like this. Thank you and have a great day.